In the modern day, Jane Austen is mainly associated with the enormously successful television adaptations of her books, Mansfield Park, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Persuasion, and of course the well-known Pride and Prejudice. Since the creation of these movies, the number of people who take the time to read her renowned novels has dwindled, and because of this, very few people recognize the social commentary hidden within them. Austen's often satirical works contain themes and characters that question the social norms during the 18th and 19th centuries. In particular, many of Austen's novels question the role of women, and it is these works that have earned Jane Austen a place with the early forerunners of feminism. Jane Austen was born at her family's home, the Steventon Parsonage in Hampshire, England, on December 16, 1775. Austen had 6 brothers and 1 sister. When Austen was only 7, she was sent away to boarding school. In 1783, she and her sister caught a fever. They became so ill they were removed from school. Jane never learned much from the school she attended, other than perhaps some piano, dancing, French, spelling, and needlework, and soon returned home to the Steventon Parsonage. Here, in her father's library, is where Jane Austen would do most of her learning.
Jane Austen was educated. She was only at Reading Ladies Boarding School for about a year and a half, and then came home, and most of her life she was just given access to her father's library, which was extensive. It had hundreds of volumes. She read anything and everything she wanted. So she read histories, she read novels. Her family read lots of novels, and they discussed them. They read plays, they put on theatricals at home, they went to the theater when they were in town. She was very well educated, but sort of at home in her own way.
Her home would also be where Jane Austen would create many of the first drafts of her well-known novels. Despite the fact that by modern standards, Jane Austen would not be considered a feminist, when exploring the roles of women during this time, Austen's quietly subversive ways distinguish her as a feminist author. Using her books and characters as her outlets, Austen spread her ideas and helped create the environment which fostered the feminist movement. Feminism can be defined as advocating social, political, and all other rights of women equal to those of men. In modern times, feminism is often associated with radical organizations, but during Jane Austen's time, the position of women was such that they were inferior to men. Thus, feminism, throughout Austen's era, meant advocating basic rights for women. During the 18th century, many major philosophers speculated upon the role of women in society. Well-known philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau theorized on the rights of women in his book Emile. He believed women should work in a separate sphere from men. Specifically, he felt that women should remain in the domestic sphere, only tending to matters of the home. In a reactionary work entitled A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, Mary Wollstonecraft essentially defined the feminist movement of this time. Wollstonecraft, as well as other feminists of the late 18th century, made implicit references to the position of women in society, especially where education and marriage were concerned. Feminists desired to see women become not necessarily equal to men, but more educated in such a way that they were no longer completely dependent upon their husbands. They wanted to develop the minds of women to prevent them from senselessly following the whim of men. Wollstonecraft summarized these beliefs when she wrote,
"Strengthen the female mind by enlarging it, and there will be an end to blind obedience."
This idea coincides with their beliefs concerning marriage. Feminists fought to improve the marriage arrangement so that women would no longer be like slaves to their husbands. They believed educating women could prevent them from entering such arrangements. Also, feminists argued that educating women would be beneficial for society as a whole, because an educated wife and mother would pass on her knowledge to her children. Wollstonecraft wrote,
"Contending for the rights of women, my main argument is built upon this simple principle, that if she be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue, for truth must be common to all, or it will be inefficacious with respect to its influence on general practice." There is evidence that Jane Austen read the works of Wollstonecraft and other feminists like her. Their thoughts are reflected in Austen's novels, such as Mansfield Park. Julia and Maria Bertram attend schools that primarily focus on etiquette. Education for women at this time usually involved acquiring accomplishments such as singing, drawing, French, as well as a thorough understanding of music, geography, and history. Fanny Price, in contrast, acquires the majority of her education from her cousin Edmund. Her education primarily focuses on wider, judicious reading. Jane Austen disliked the schooling provided for women in the early 1800s. She passionately expresses her beliefs through the fates of Maria, Julia, and Fanny. As previously mentioned, Maria Bertram receives a limited education. Unfortunately, this inadequate education attributes to her demise. She thoughtlessly enters into a marriage with a man whom she neither respects nor loves. Sadly, Maria has a torrid affair with Mr. Henry Crawford, the result of which being her social ruin. Julia Bertram later elopes with Mr. Crawford in the same careless fashion. In doing so, she destroys both her reputation as well as any chance that she had at a successful life. Both the Bertram sisters suffered miserably due to their lack of extensive schooling. Fanny, on the other hand, uses her far-reaching education to make sensible decisions. Fanny's wise course of action leads to her marriage with Edmund and ultimately her happiness. On the topic of marriage, Wollstonecraft and Austen both wanted a wider education for women, so that they would be intelligent companions for their husbands. Writers like Fordyce were scared by the prospect of well-educated women, and recommended female frailty in the marriage to promote the male protective urge. Many of the supporting characters in Austen's novels are unhappy as a direct result of their marriages. For example, Lady Middleton, Isabella Knightley, and Mary Musgrove cannot match the intellect of their husbands, and, because of this, they immerse themselves in the domestic roles of wife and mother and nothing else. This results in their unhappiness. In Persuasion, Mary Musgrove follows Fordyce's recommendation. This results in a poor relationship with her husband. In regards to this relationship, Austen writes,
"A more equal match might have improved him. A woman of real understanding might have given more consequence to his character, and more usefulness, rationality, and elegance to his habits and pursuits."
Austen felt that a wider education for women was necessary to produce intelligent companions which would allow a marriage to flourish. Wollstonecraft and Austen were by no means against marriage. They recognized it as the natural state for women, but they desired a partnership of equals, which, more often than not, did not occur at this time. This belief appears in many of Austen's novels. Each of her heroines enters into a marriage with a man who could only be considered her equal. Most notably, Emma and Mr. Knightley, along with Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, enter into marriages that are disputatiously engaging, due to the fact that each pair is a match of intellectual equals. Austen's personal beliefs are also confirmed in her letters to her niece Fanny Knight, when she writes in pertinence to Fanny's engagement,
"You are too agreeable in your single state, too agreeable as a niece. I shall hate you when your delicious play of mind is all settled down into conjugal and maternal affections."
Although Jane Austen was not as outspoken as certain activists, her quietly subversive ways began to spark the flame that became the feminist movement. While most women were content to accept society and its restraints, Austen was bold enough to distinguish herself by voicing her opinion. Her books slowly circulated her ideas throughout society, and although they would not be accepted at this time, her ideas urged women to question their role in society. Over the course of the century following Austen's work, the movement gained momentum, ultimately resulting in equality for women. Austen was one of the few early feminists who dared to rouse her fellow women and begin to organize them toward a common cause. More recently, Austen's work continued to impact feminist movements all over the world. In Iran, Azar Nafisi introduced Pride and Prejudice to her female students to give them faith and freedoms, despite the fact that their society represses them. While it may be difficult to compare Austen to modern feminists, her decisions to aid in the feminist movement through the spread of her discreet social commentaries distinguishes her as a remarkable individual who can only be considered a forerunner of feminism.